Good evening, everyone. I am Mohammed Al-Khairi, a filmmaker and associate programmer with Cinema Politica. We're thrilled to virtually welcome you to an event inspired by Amar Aziz and Christopher Patz's film, Immigrant Workers, a powerful film about labor justice and an inspiring and moving journey of an activist battling her way along the global supply chain of the fashion industry. And we're extremely honored to host a special guest tonight. Directors Amar Aziz and Christopher Patz are here, as well as Sohnia Karamat Ali from Comité d'Action de Parc Extension, and Mostafa Henaway from Immigrant Workers Centre. Also, Dr. Mubbashir Rizvi graciously accepted our invitation to host the event. Tonight's event is co-sponsored by the Immigrant Workers Centre, South Asian Women's Community Centre, Comité d'Action de Parc Extension, and Cinéma sous le toit. We hope our events can help you stay engaged and inspired until we can gather and celebrate activist cinema once again in the theaters. In the meantime, please check out our offerings in our Cinema Politica on-demand platforms. Sign up for our newsletters and follow us on social media so that we can keep you informed about upcoming events. We begin this event by acknowledging that Cinema Politica's main office is located on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation. We believe it's not enough to acknowledge the title holders of the land where we live and work. Rather, we urge everyone who attends our screenings to become involved in anti-colonial and indigenous-led struggles and resistance in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, and beyond. Tonight, we're hosting our event on the Zoom platform, which is headquartered on the Muwekma Ohlone territory. We acknowledge Indigenous stewardship, presence, and sovereignty beyond land and into these virtual spaces as well. Now, a quick breakdown of tonight's event. We'll start off with a brief introduction, and then our guests will engage in a conversation about the film and their work for about 30 minutes. After that, we will open the floor for questions from the audience. So we invite you to please send your questions via the webinar or in the comments on YouTube and Facebook, where we will also be live streaming the event. And now I'm going to hand over to Dr. Mubbashir Rizvi, who is an assistant professor in cultural anthropology at Georgetown University. His research and teaching interests span social movements, environmental justice, indigenous and peasant land rights, post-colonial militarization, race, and empire. His book, The Ethics of Staying, Social Movements and Land Rights in Pakistan, examines the rise of a land rights movement that challenged the Pakistani military's policy to privatize state-owned farms. His research publication analyzed the moral economy of infrastructure projects, the use of counterterrorism policies to suppress peasant/indigenous demands for land rights, and the complexities arising from civil society/NGO involvement in grassroots struggles. His publications appear in History and Anthropology, Anthropology Today, South Asian History and Culture, Verge, and Text, Performance and Practice. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Mubbashir. And I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. Thank you. And thank you for all for joining us for this really important conversation and discussion and film, Discounted Workers, that tells the story of one of the most underreported industrial accidents that highlight the violence and exploitation of labor in the supply chain economies of the world distributed all over the world. This story takes place in Karachi, and it also foregrounds even less told story of resilience and activism, grassroots activism by Sayyida Khatun. And I commend the directors, and I like to introduce the filmmakers. Amar Aziz is a filmmaker and a poet from Pakistan. He's a recipient of the International Federation of Film Critics Award, among several other accolades. He has been selected for some of the most prestigious film festivals, including the IDFA, Hot Docs Jean Rouge International Film Festival and Moscow International, Moscow International Documentary Festival in over 100 countries. His poetry, published in various international literary journals, has appeared and forthcoming in several anthologies. He lives in Lahore. I believe his films have been shown in over 100 countries. I also like to welcome Christopher Patz. He's a documentary filmmaker and collaborator with Ammar, and he works at the European Coalition of Corporate Justice, which campaigns for corporate accountability legislation in Europe. Previously, he worked on judicial and non-judicial cases against European brands, like the one featured in today's film, Kick, and private auditors for their involvement in factory fires and collapses in South Asia. He holds an LLB and graduate diploma in legal practice from the Australian National University. Welcome. Next up is Sohnia Karamat Ali, who has worked as an activist and educator in Pakistan Institute of Labor Education and Research from 2001 to 2007, along with being part of a research, in addition to her research on labor issues, mainly on bonded labor, Sonia has also worked on labor education workshops with workers from the garment and textile industries, in light engineering, fisheries, and domestic workers, among other industries. After arriving in Montreal, Sonia first invested a good amount of time in acquiring French. We are in Pakistan or Anglophone, and Urdu speaking, if you can speak Urdu, and also local languages. But she's worked and volunteered with South Asian Women's Community Centre, Immigrant Workers Centre, Solidarity Without Borders. And since 2005, Sonia has been working with Comité Action, Parc Extension, Parc X. Cape is a, and then I will move to Mostafa Henaway, who's also a longtime community organizer, a radio producer, and writer. He has been a community organizer with Immigrant Workers Centre in Montreal since 2007, organizing with textile warehouse workers, and many other precarious immigrants and migrants from both migrant and labor justice. Mustafa is currently a co-producer of Labor Radio on CKUT 90.3 FM and a facilitator at the Labor College of Canada. He also is a PhD candidate at Concordia University, focusing on Amazon and logistics workers. Thank you all for joining us. And again, I'd like to commend the filmmakers for highlighting this really important and underreported story about the industrial fire in Ali Enterprises in Karachi that took lives of about 255 or 260 people, hundreds of injured. And so naturally, the first question I would like to turn to the filmmakers is to ask you, what made you decide to highlight this story and focus on how to tell this story by featuring an activist like Sayeeda Khatun, and how to, so if you can tell us a little bit about how you got started in making of this film. I'll turn to Ammar first.
Thank you, Dr. Rizvi. I'm really grateful to Cinema Politica for inviting us here. I think because of the pandemic, we couldn't really screen the film, widely. We've had a couple of screenings, but like everything else, we've just been waiting for the right time. So it's a great honor and pleasure to be able to show this film to a wider audience through your platform. To answer your question, I think I would like to, pass the mic to Chris, because he was already working as a legal consultant with this organization that was representing Sayeeda Khatun and others, her comrades from Karachi. So it was Chris who initiated, the project while working with the lawyers, and I joined in a bit later. And then, you know, from there on, we have both been working on this film. It has taken us a few years, but maybe Chris, you would want to say a few things. How did you think about this idea?
Ammar, I wonder, Chris might have dropped, the signal might have dropped from him. So if I may ask you another follow-up question, one of the most amazing things about this film is how you follow Sayyidah Khatun as she's organizing through working class neighborhoods where Chris is back. Chris, we were just asking about how this film was conceived, and it was partly through your advocacy work with Sayyidah on this.
With the legal team in Berlin.
With the legal. If you can tell us a little.
That's right. Sure. Can you hear me okay? I'm sorry, though, it's really bad connection where I am. Good. Okay. So yeah, I mean, I basically met Sayyidah when I was working on her legal team in Berlin. So with a collective of lawyers there who were representing her and some of the other workers or families of the deceased workers in their case against the German brand. And as you know from the film, it's the first such case that was to be brought judicially against a German company for something that's happened outside of Germany. So attempting to push the liability in law of a company for what's happening along its supply chain. So I met her during that process, and I was studying film at the time, and after meeting her, it was clear that she was somebody who could certainly carry an entire film. She's a very watchable, likable, but also complex, angry, which is fantastic, of course, for all the joint work that we do, but able to challenge that or channel that rather into a pragmatic sense of commitment and devotion. So that's where it all began. And the only reason I felt comfortable making this film from the beginning was because it concerned a German textile brand. That's sort of my connection into the whole thing. And then it was fantastic that, of course, we managed to get Ammar as well to join and agree to be co-director to this project as somebody from the region who has been so involved with local labor movements, but as well who is a poet, which is something that contrasts nicely with my background as a lawyer. I'm not sure if we'd have finished the film if it was just me being a lawyer. So yeah.
Yeah. And Ammar, or maybe if I can get a bit more sense of how did someone who's a grassroots worker, who's advocating on behalf of families, is able to make a connection to transnational groups as well as local. Perhaps I can bring in also Sonia in this, in terms of how did Sayyidah Khatun and her grassroots mobilization, she was able to kind of create an organization through which she was able to connect with advocacy groups in Germany.
Thanks, Mubbashir. Well, as I was following this, the entire accident very closely, so I could tell you that right from the beginning, there were some, concerned labor organizations, labor federations, for example, this National Labor Federation. We see Mr. Nasir Mansoor, who is there even in the documentary. They were there to reach out the community, and they were there to pass the message and to connect the community, the victims, and to this to the platform, and especially they were there to file the petition on behalf of them so that they can make responsible the buyer, the German company KIK in the Germany. So though as we know that the trade union movement itself, it's not really strong in Pakistan, but whatever shape it is in there, and besides the trade union movement and this concerned labor organizations who are there to support workers, especially the workers in the informal sector, they were there right from the day one with the community, and they were able to put them in contact with, with German government, with German civil society, and in the same time, let me tell you that when this incident happened, a very tragic one, uh, basically, Kate, the German company, they had contacted, the labor movement in Pakistan at first place. They wanted to do some compensation, but without taking the responsibility. So, yeah, that was the reality. In fact, they contacted the labor movement in Bangladesh because they were in contact with the trade unions in Bangladesh, and through Bangladeshi trade union movement, they contacted Pakistani counterparts, and then they offered a kind of some compensation, and but they wanted to do it on some on a kind of a humanitarian basis without taking the responsibility. And I guess at some point we will come back that the entire idea was to make them responsible. Yeah, but let us not forget the two side of the picture. Yes.
No, I think what you just mentioned is so important that, there is, even though it's fairly small, uh, a, a infrastructure of advocacy, labor organizations, unions, that someone like Saida Khatun was able to tap or have or work with to be able to initiate her campaign. But one of the important elements that really comes across in the film, and goes back to Ammar, is the way she is able to hold everyone together, because this is a campaign she leads for 8 years in isolation. And you see in the film constantly being pushed around, lawyers not showing up, dealing with bureaucracy, and international transnational corporation. So if you can tell us about how you try to capture and how you were able to tell her formidable personality. So if you can tell us more about how you got to win her trust and how you worked with her, Ammar.
Sure. So, when Saida and Aziz and other people, of course, when they lost their children, their loved ones, these people were not political, most of them. We know about Saida and Aziz for sure. They were not aware about their rights. They were not involved with any grassroots movement. So it was a sort of a transformation that has taken place over the last several years, which made them or turned them into activists, so when we met them, Saida was still going through this transformation. Now she's really political. She's an activist, not someone who, not a mother who is hoping to get compensation because she lost her son, but she's a proletarian activist who wants to change things. So I think that's a major thing that we have witnessed. But when we met her, of course, she was already out there, and she was already working with the people. And of course, during this time, the National Trade Union Federation of Pakistan, which Sonia also mentioned, Nasir Mansoor and other labor leaders in Karachi, they also played a very significant role to kind of, to politicize these workers, and not just to see them as victims, but to see them as people who can actually change things. So it has taken them a lot of time, and I hope the film captures a little bit of that. So in the beginning, for example, the mood is a bit more depressing, and they're, of course, because it's a tragedy and they have to suffer every day. But in the film we wanted to kind of show this graph a little bit, by starting from a more subjective pain, and then slowly leading towards the larger picture. And
Yeah.
That's how we thought.
I think some of the most, I think that it comes across really well, especially with her advocating in Geneva, and also going back and holding rallies in Karachi. And if I can ask a question to Mustafa, picking up from what Ammar was saying and what Sonia had mentioned, this question of these supply chains are very much built around exploitation of precarious labor, and they are also very much exploiting the lack of protection or lack of regulations that are taking place in many parts of the world. And so with your work, Mustafa, I was wondering how you see the parallels in terms of organizing a kind of a labor politics that takes in account of the supply chain. One of the things that was really evocative, what Sonia was saying, is that you always look at your shirt and wonder if it's soaked with someone else's blood. And I think that goes to the heart of how do we think what is our relationship to labor with everything. So I was wondering, given your work on various different aspects of migrant laborers and also precarious labor, uh, what kind of lessons you draw from the film, or perhaps if you have a kind of comment on this question of labor in these precarious modes of supply chains that exploit that precarity?
Well, I mean, I guess in general, I mean, there are parallels, maybe not to the extent of obviously the extent of exploitation, but what you have is, I mean, unfortunately, I mean, is ostensibly is Western corporations, transnational corporations, who've been able to sort of manipulate, you know, the global integration of markets of in terms of capital flight and the movement of capital to be able to sort of build and exploit these kinds of supply chains. And you know, and the parallels are stunning. I mean, especially being here in Montreal, where actually, unfortunately, Montreal used to be a large textile hub, right? It used to be the fourth largest in North America, and you know, and many of those jobs are actually held by immigrants who came from the countries in which those jobs were you know sent to. You know, you had people from Pakistan and Sri Lanka and Bangladesh actually packing their own sewing machines back to Bangladesh and Pakistan, and to be able to exploit lower wages and create the kind of conditions that you see. And one of the striking things about the film is the way that they create these supply chains to sort of diffuse the sort of this responsibility, right? That and there was a striking part in the film. I believe they were in Berlin, and you know, and one of the speakers is what does this actually have to do with Kick? You know, what does this actually? How are they responsible? This is, you know, this is another company, and you constantly have the same structure, and you have that here, and you have that, you have internal supply chains where you know, at the end of the day, you can have in sectors such as healthcare where these are decent unionized jobs, and then they are subcontracted and subcontracted and subcontracted, and you'll have someone making below minimum wage in horrific conditions who are with precarious status. You have people working at the choke points of these supply chains, right? So if you look at modern day, if you look at the way global supply chains work, it's not that workers in the global north produce those goods anymore. Much of those goods are produced in places like Karachi or in Bangladesh or in China. But what's the critical labor now that's being exploited is the distribution of those goods, right? The flexible, just-in-time distribution to match that flexible, just-in-time production, right? And with the same conditions, non-unionized, impossible to unionize, subcontract, without basic health and safety, and much of this is to ensure a level of profitability that we haven't seen it, and it creates immense difficulties for the labor movement. People are find it very difficult to organize under such conditions. Unions are unable to meet to the challenges, but then you have leaders who really come through, like in the film, who can bring people together and say, no, that this is not enough. And even in our own experience fighting some textile giants, you know, there was women who were similar, who actually did mobilize, and for quite a long time, to ensure that there was justice.
Yeah. I mean, picking up from what you're saying, and this is a question for Ammar and maybe Christopher. One of the things that Mustafa is saying is that there's this, and also Sonia, if you'd like to respond, with subcontracting, with supply chains, you have this, labor is always invisible, but it becomes hyper invisible. So people only act as consumers and they don't know that there's production involved. But one of the ways of breaking that invisibility is storytelling and film, as you do in the, and I was wondering, there were certain elements that were very powerful in the film. Some of them were photographs where people were talking about their deceased loved ones, trying to bring them back as human beings, their lives, the use of emotions, and also the cell phone footage that you used, Ammar. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about these kinds of creative, if not creative, but as a kind of storytelling decisions that you made as a filmmaker to communicate and break that invisibility that is being forced upon by supply chain precarity.
Yeah. There's a lot of invisibility, absence, you know, you don't really see these people who are making these products for you. Even if they're alive, right? And once they are gone, if they die, you know, during an occupational safety and health, whatever accident, it's very unlikely that you're ever going to humanize them, you know. And especially in this case, because when this tragedy happened in Pakistan, there was a lot of so there was a lot of media attention, but everybody was talking about this political party which was allegedly involved in the fire, and nobody really wanted to talk about the brands, you know, or the auditing company which just gave this factory a certificate of clearance probably 20 days before the fire happened, you know. So you could feel that media wanted to sell this as a sensational story, but they just wanted to talk about the people, the criminals who were uh, probably responsible. So you know, it is, and when we were pitching the film, you know, in order to find some partners, you know, to get some support, this was, I think, one of the biggest challenge, because we couldn't really convince any potential partners about the significance of a story like this, because you know, labor issues are considered something from the past, from the 20th century, and ever since the you know, the end of the Cold War, or you know, people just think that now it's very irrelevant, you know. So you want to make films about terrorism, especially from a country like Pakistan, you know. Uh, you want to make films about other issues, you know, which sell really well in the Western markets. But for a labor film, I think it was very difficult. You know, a film about an imaginative artificial intelligence would have a higher chance to get support. But this film, which was about 260 workers who lost their lives, nobody wanted to. So we're very thankful to whatever little support that we managed to receive. But I think to answer your question about the craft and the form, one thing that I had in my mind was, and maybe Chris can add, you know, from his perspective, that I always thought that this is going to be an observational film, you know, kind of an approach which is usually referred to as fly on the wall in film language, in which the filmmakers remain invisible, behind the camera. The people you're working with, they never talk to you. There are no interviews. They never talk into the camera. So you're trying to capture that reality, in their intimate spaces, while you're always behind the camera. It's not self-reflexive, the film, right? You don't see us, you don't hear our voices. So this was one stylistic choice, and the other one was about the pace, because when you make a film like this, which follows a legal a struggle, which is very absurd, which is very slow, which is very monotonous. The film is also going to be a bit slow. The film is also going to be a bit monotonous. It can't be, you can't have these artificial dramatic highs and lows in the film graph, I mean. The film is eventually going to reflect, that pace of their real lives. It was very, it was almost like a story written by Kafka, in which these characters are trying to get some justice, and there's no way, wherever they go, the courtrooms that you see in Karachi and then the courtrooms that you see in Berlin, they're very alike, despite being very different, from the outer side. They're very, the way they work. So it was a bit like that. And these were some of the things that I had in my mind. And maybe Chris, if you would like to add something to this.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I like the way that you put it, Mubbashir, that yeah, workers today are invisible, and those in the first tier, the second tier, the third tier of the supply chain are even more invisible, if that was even possible. So yeah, I'm very happy that this could be one way to give more exposure and more platform and more visibility to the people who make our clothes, and the incredible personal stories and likeness that they have to so much of the labor movements and movements for social justice in the global north and all around. Of course, this is the work of so many NGOs and trade unions, exactly to give this visibility. And there are global movements to make sure that visibility becomes a part of the global economy and everyday business. This movement for a UN binding treaty, which was featured at the end of the film, as a way to name and shame the European nations for not being there. Canada as well is not there either. Yeah, it's all part of the project to get not just more visibility, but more participation, of course, of workers, autonomous workers and their representatives in how business is done.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And I wanted to kind of return back to this idea of some of the specific elements, but I'll just pick up from there, Christopher, what the point he mentioned. And to Sonia, one of the things that comes across in the film also is a lot of workers and laborers saying that even though there might be rules and laws that allow for unionizing, it's become more and more impossible to have even a conversation around that. And then there's a Human Rights Watch report from a few years ago explicitly talking about how the industrial worker labor union sector has been intimidated both through various different means. So you having experience working with labor organizations, both in the unions and outside, and also the fact that labor itself is becoming disaggregated, where there's less and less factories, piecework, or informal small factories at home. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the challenges and also means some of the more newer techniques that are being developed in mobilizing, organizing workers.
Yes. Okay. Thanks, Mubbashir. Yeah, we know that, like unionization, forming the labor union, it remains, in fact, to date, it's the biggest challenge in Pakistani society. Right from the beginning, we can see that, starting from the first dictatorship of Ayub Khan, there were, kind of like, for example, they were against trade unionism, and they were against trade unions. They really wanted to suppress the strength of the labor, of the majority class. Yeah. So, and then of course, like we see there is a kind of a continuity right from the beginning. We see that, after the creation of Pakistan, there, given that the population at that time, we had we had 25% workforce which was unionized, which has gradually declined. Right now, given this humongous, like a workforce, the population in Pakistan, it's I guess it's only the 5% workers who are unionized, and even those 5%, they are not really, in a real collective bargaining position. No, we see that, on one hand, state give, state make and harm some, from time to time, banning trade unions, and the other hand, they also allowed many unions which were allowed to be formed on the plant, uh, like many unions at one plant. Okay, so which basically, which also, may cause a huge kind of
Right.
harm to the labor movement and to the trade union movement in Pakistan. So yeah, and then of course we see that the state is quite, like suppressive. It's against the working class. Of course, they never wanted to share their power because of so many vested interests, and there is a history in Pakistan to suppress the majority. So it is, on the basis of language, and, there could be many forms, but it was there right from the beginning. So, and then, yeah, so, and then in the same time, it's a highly fragmented society, So making a union, especially in a context where many unions were possible at one plant, it further, like weakened it was against the strength of one unionized trade union movement. So given this context, at one point, after the longest awaited labor policy in around 2001, at least there were some kind of possibility that workers of one sector can form their sector-wise unions. So it would be less intimidated. It'd be like, for example, uh, because we know the employers are quite they are quite intimidating, and then the same time, we are talking about a city like Karachi, which has really suffered a worst form of sectarian violence also. So there were many factors which was anti-labor, and there were many discouraging factors who were anti, like unions, labor unions. So yeah, so in this kind of situation, and we know it's the same. The reality is same till today. So I would say that we can still try to make, to unionize the workers on sector basis. So it will be, like outside the plants, but it will lesser the intimidation. In the same time, it can, it can bring more solidarity, more strength across country, and at least across, like provinces who are in the where we find the same industrial sectors. So that could be the one possibility. In the same time, we need to, we need a solidarity, like across from, the society, and maybe support group, more and more groups, who are there to stand in solidarity with the workers, because right now, unfortunately, trade unionism, standing in solidarity with workers, it is something, I guess, least romantic. People are not really taking it up, so
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, I think one of the things that you mentioned a lot of really important points, and sometimes people say that these are specific to some place like Pakistan, but there are many ways in which the social fabric or what we call the working class communities or labor neighborhoods have decimated. In part, neighborhoods would change. Sometimes a riot does that, where people are moved along different ethnic and sectarian lines. So it's become over the course an identity or a creation of a kind of unified politics has become more and more difficult. Um, and along with that, there's there's echoes of that shared all over the world, including problems in America with deindustrialization and not having a cities or towns where people can organize in that way. Um, so I was gonna maybe Christopher had something to say about that. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that's something really to pick up on something Sonia and Mubbashir that you're getting at there, which is I mean, there was one scene which we didn't include in the film, which was really beautiful, where Saida and Aziz are speaking on the rooftop of the trade union, and they're basically saying, you know, when we first met these trade unionists, when they reached out to us to help us, we were really skeptical because we're religious people, you know, and these were trade unionists, these were communists, and we're religious people, so we were skeptical. But then we realized that, you know, their actions essentially are speaking, you know, louder than anything we've heard before about them, and that these efforts are genuine, and that they're really at the end of the day humanists in a way, in so many words. But it was a really beautiful explanation, and it goes a bit to the different ways that trade unionism has been demonized, I suppose, in the East and in the West as well, in the many different ways. So yeah, I agree with Sonia. These days, it's not as romantic international solidarity as perhaps it once was. But let's hope with new technologies and narratives that it can indeed be, because it does deliver results. Let's know. Of course, we all know that the only things that we have won have been through these organized social movements.
Absolutely, yeah. If I could turn back to Mustafa, and one thing that has been known to us in the last 10-15 years is a different type of solidarity that's expressed by the way people consume. They're conscientious consumers. They try to get things with a certain kind of label, certain kind of certification, and we see also the limits of that, because you have in organizations that are certifying things that are not true, like RENA did. So I was wondering, in terms of what Christopher was mentioning, are there projects, or are there ways in which certain forms of solidarity are being expressed in certain industries, or in reaction? Like you mentioned something about textile workers. So in response to what happened in Bangladesh and what happened in Dhaka and in Karachi, has there been, in your knowledge, some kind of elements of labor unions working in tandem with each other? Kind of Christopher was getting at that as well. So if you have any knowledge of those kinds of transnational solidarities that are being developed.
I mean, unfortunately, I mean, Christopher was kind of right that it's not the same. If people remember what the political landscape was 25 years ago, you'd be fearful if you were progressive or an activist to wear Nike shoes because of sweatshop conditions in the Philippines or somewhere else. And it was easy because it was only one brand and a particular scale of shoes, right? But now, because the type of labor conditions are so rampant, right, that it's the entire development model for the entire global South, right? And this is what gives it so much, these corporations so much power, that they can pick up and leave. If workers in Karachi organize one day, what stops them from going to Bangladesh another day, right? There's no power to stop them, and so solidarity does become really important, because the power in terms of the value of the profit, all of it stems from here, right? It stems from Europe and North America, and so there have been campaigns, but unfortunately not enough. So there is the Clean Clothes Network in Europe, which has tried to do some organizing around what took place around Rana Plaza, but not enough. There was no equivalent to that here in Canada, even though we were responsible. Brands such as Joe Fresh, which is part of a large grocer company, was found to have some marks and brands in the Rana Plaza fire, but we didn't see any organizing or solidarity around that. And so, unfortunately, there is a kind of there's been a limit, but I believe there's also kind of a hope in terms of recent solidarity campaigns. So you do have networks now, such as the Transnational Institute, but also not just the Clean Clothes campaign. I mean, back then there was the Students Against Sweatshops, but that kind of organizing doesn't exist per se, and it raises an interesting question in terms of sort of global politics and global solidarity. And I wish I could be more optimistic in terms of what exists currently, and maybe others can add, but I feel that outside of groups such as Alternatives here in Montreal, which try to present and try to bring together sort of a grassroots, sort of worker to worker solidarity and between social movements, and put a lens on the global south, there hasn't been enough, because the level and the scale of violence, right, that has taken place, between what took place in Karachi, what took place in Rana Plaza, should have shaken the system of the way that we produce and consume, but it didn't, right? And that, to me, is a signal of how it's not been enough. And it's not just about holding corporations accountable, right? When we look at multilateral institutions that also enable it, right? So we no longer challenge the WTO or the IMF or the World Bank for being, not just for creating the rules that allow these corporations to do this.
And the states themselves, that's something that came up, enabling this. In fact, as you were talking, I was thinking that model has proliferated in our everyday life with food vendoring, cab, taxi driving. We are contracting ourselves, our free time all the time. So, and all that space is left outside of unionizing. And so one of the ways it will be to rethink idea of labor in broadly speaking. I think maybe it's a good time to open up the Q&A for our audience, and if anyone wants to kind of submit questions in the Q&A. But go ahead, Sonia. Yeah. As the questions come in, you can go ahead.
Can I quickly make a point? Just as Christopher mentioned this, this sense of division between labor and the labor movement being Muslim and communist. So I would like to, because anyways I always think in terms of these lines, and it's a kind of another hindrance, which is it's going up. It's quite anti-labor, anti-union forming, because the way the Pakistani state has imposed and manipulated the religion, that is also something, it has really, it has went against the labor movement, because the way they are, the delivering the message that now it's very simply, everybody is preparing for the next life, they are not at all considered, they are not at all bothered. In fact, as much they suffer, as much they will get in the next life. So that is also something which is playing a major role. And we really need to ask this question to ourselves, that why a handful of minority will enjoy everything in this life, and the rest of the majority will get everything in the next life. But this factor is really playing a decisive role, and people are, because anyways, as we talked about this, this discouraging condition, this entire labor like environment for forming the unions, it's not easy. In this, with this kind of sentiments, people are giving up. So this sentiment is very much there, and it's really it's dangerous. Thank you so much.
No, thank you for raising that point. And I think we have a couple of things happening with that, because, this was a strategy in the 1960s to discourage, especially in the Muslim world, rise of socialism or any kind of left, because religion was seen as kind of antithesis. But with Sayyida Khatun, you see another example of someone who's very pious, very religious, but it's also very much part of the labor movement. And often, I think that's a really important representation to have. And Ammar, if you wanted to talk a little bit more about
Just one quick point, as Sonia was mentioning, this notion of socialism being anti-religion. I think a lot of this propaganda was also created by the CIA in our region, and that's not. I wouldn't shy about naming them, because they actually, in the 80s, there were jokes and stories about communists doing the kind of stuff which Muslims wouldn't approve of, just to create this hatred, during the last decade of the Afghan war, last decade of the Cold War, which led to the Soviet split and to the fall of the People's Democratic Republic of Afghanistan. So I think all of this that we are witnessing even now, after 20, 30 years, it has the roots in the same kind of investment which was done by the CIA with the help of the Pakistani state, of course, So in order to counter that, I think we don't have, the progressives in the country have never had the kind of resources to get rid of these notions, because we are not really reaching out to the people as massively as the state.
one. I appreciate that point, and one of the things that I was thinking about is, this is a very I agree with your assessment, but drawing back to what Mustafa was saying, that this is a trend that you also see in non-Muslim countries as well. It's not peculiar to the experience where you have labor or union participation that was much higher in the 70s or 50s and 60s, that has diminished considerably in that sense, right? And it has a lot to do with the global trade and treaties as well. So in that sense, I mean, I think one of the questions that also comes up today in contemporary issues in terms of how to hold transnational corporations accountable, and also limiting, maybe the emphasis should also be on regulating and limiting the shape of distribution chains. What kind of laws and what kind of responsibility has to be taken if you produce abroad for any transnational corporation, because they're operating in a terrain that has no law. You can park your money in an island, you can produce in some other country. So these are, I'm just thinking in terms of creatively, solidarity movements could be oriented towards coming up with a new rule of business, maybe globally. And this has been the demand for international solidarity movements since the 90s. It diminished after 9/11 with global war and terror, where we didn't have these kinds of international world social forums that were happening in the 90s and 2000s. But that's a possibility for activists to gather together. Christopher, you had.
Yeah, I mean, to that point, what are movements coalescing around as a political objective at the moment? I mean, there was a movement in the early 90s in human rights law at the United Nations to make transnational corporations responsible directly for human rights violations. Now, countries, states under human rights law only responsible for human rights violations directly. But there was this movement because people, the South knew you had, South governments bringing this to the UN, the outsourcing, the offshoring, the human rights violations after, disasters like Bhopal and all of these. And we lost that fight to make corporations directly responsible for human rights violations. But what came out of that at the United Nations was something called human rights due diligence, which was basically a merger of the concept of human rights responsibilities and the business concept of due diligence, that you have to do business diligently. And so this notion is now being turned into law around the world, in particular, and off to a slow start in Europe. But this is not being discussed. This new type of supply chain liability, these new types of laws to regulate the behavior of European and international businesses when they're operating in the global South in a way that gives new legal rights to workers in these countries in a way that we've never seen before. This was the test case in this example. So there are movements, and the global trade union confederations have coalesced around these ideas, and we would sincerely urge the Canadian government and union movement to push for a corporate accountability law that is basically the legalization of a soft law international standard that has existed for 10 years. So it's a very strong political and legal foundation to make for new laws. I know in the last 5 years or so, the Thoreau government has promised a new corporate justice commissioner or ombudsman or some rubbish like this, which was not effective in granting new rights to business. I've understood that so-called progressive government hasn't even delivered on that promise. But looking to Europe, looking to the French devoir de vigilance, new corporate accountability and supply chains law. Also, the German government has recently, as a result of this case featured in the film, been spurred to pass new regulation to regulate the behavior of its transnational corporations. So we would really encourage all of those on the call, activists, unionists, to find space in their work for this notion of human rights due diligence and participation in treaty activism or work at the national level. I know there's incredibly different national contexts, and Europe and Canada are very different, but we would hope that there is perhaps some cause for inspiration and, of course, solidarity. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us for any information on how we're pushing for these laws in Europe. It would, of course, be a sincere pleasure.
This was you were answering a question that was raised among the audience from Qasim Tarmizi, which was
that's great. I'm happy.
How do activists who are in Montreal work in international solidarity? What kind of practice can be done, taking example of Ali Enterprise and Rana Plaza, in response to that? So from what I'm hearing, what you're saying is to connect with organizations that are looking to create international rule of law applied to transnational corporations in terms of distribution of their supply chains. They have to be responsible, labor, or allowing collective bargaining, and also minimum wage, very basic principles. So I was wondering if you guys have any questions to ask each other, or perhaps if Christopher, you wanted to add something else in terms of grassroots, like an activist sitting in Montreal, how are they tapping into the vision that, or what you're saying?
Sure. I mean, this this notion of human rights due diligence, which is accepted by business, they've been forced to accept this over the past 10 years, ensures that business has to engage with stakeholders, that they have to respect collective bargaining and the right to assembly, and other standards throughout their supply chains. So from their subsidiaries to the first tier to the second tier. Now, this is only in, it's not in law yet. And I know that there's a Canadian campaign which will begin soon for such a law. And the NGO organizations, I'm not sure about the trade unions, but involved with this are called Above Ground, is one of them. And I think there is also something like a Canadian network for corporate accountability, or something like this. In Europe, this has been achieved by a coalition of NGOs and trade unions working together, which doesn't always happen, and is sometimes quite difficult. But in this sense, it has succeeded in achieving some significant gains. And this is giving us a legal framework to then connect as NGOs and unionists in the north with the workers along the supply chain in the south. But I would be really interested to hear from the experiences of Mustafa and Sonia about transnational labor organizing, if there have been any experience or stories of the like.
And Parc Extension, the work you guys are doing through there. Yeah.
Is it okay if I go forward?
Yeah, please.
First of all, I would like to make a point. For example, we know, like the national laws were always there, and then we see this, this new concept of code of conduct, the compliances, and like social auditing, in the early 90s. So, and now we are listening this new initiative once again. But the point is that this social auditing, the compliances was going on for last already 30 years, and we see that it didn't work, it didn't help out. They were framed, they were conceived to give an extra layer of protection to the workers. In fact, the workers were really working in a vulnerable situation, and they became even more vulnerable. Nobody was direct responsible for their well-being. Okay, so what was missing, basically, we don't need new laws, new initiatives. It's basically the real implementation, the real framework. It's very simply, from my experience, what I can share. When I was working with workers in Pakistan, through this labor education workshop, the idea was to educate them regarding their rights so that they can mobilize around that, and they can ultimately form their unions to get those rights. Okay, so, and in the same time, we were watching very closely all these social auditing processes. So what was the missing link is, it has to be tripartite. It needs a workers representation. Okay, because when the auditor comes, they only, it's only between the employer and the auditor. There is no workers representation. These social auditing concept, they could have really worked out in favor of the labor, in favor of the workers, if they would really emphasize it, if they would oblige them to, to make it tripartite, to have a workers representation when these audits happen. So, and otherwise we could see, in the absence of their presence, their representation, it didn't work. It didn't work well. So we need to really think about the mechanisms. And yeah, and then I would like to come back, the situation in Parc Extension. That is something I would really like to share, because after working with the workers in the third world, what I have been seeing here in Montreal, in the real, in the north. So we would read about it, but I have seen the south in the north. So this, this Parc Extension is a working class community. So and it's mainly immigrant workers, immigrant economic migrants. Okay, mainly without any unfortunately unskilled laborers, and there are no vocational training program for those, like people. No government took pain to provide them some, like basic vocational training so that they can, enter properly in the job market. So yeah, it's more or less same here, like in Pakistan to date, we are asking for the living minimum wage. It's the same, it's the same issue here. People who work and they remain under the poverty line, they are working poor, because even according to the government standard, they work, but they don't give a living wage. And whatever they earn, it remains, under whatever, according, the line the government set, it's not up to there. So yeah, it's a very working class community. Um, I'm basically working with tenants, which are, which are really oppressed in this present scenario, given the housing crisis in Montreal, given the in the absence of rent control from the government. It's being tenant, they are really facing hardships, and on being a worker, they are forced to work. They, especially, there are no opportunity for a decent work where they can live. They can actually earn a living minimum wage. So it's a more or less same issues. It's really surprising, but it's more or less same. The health and safety issues, being a tenant, the conditions they are facing in their apartments and the conditions they are facing at the workplaces. It's quite, like
I mean, this is
very
going
same.
back to, and I think maybe this would be one of the last questions, but Mustafa, going back to the work of Parc Extension, there is one thing that we saw in the film also is, and the question is asked by Piyusha Chatterjee, is that, the conditions for workers are almost like, it's not like they have much of a choice in the kind of work they pick up on, right? It's almost like I don't want to conflate too many different things, but there's idea of, it almost brings you idea of bonded or debt labor, that you are, it's not like you have a choice. You work in these impossible conditions in the basements of these factories where you can't hardly breathe. So there is, and then there's this question of a lot of as Sonia was saying, that there are a lot of people who are finding some increasingly in more desperate situations, especially if they're not documented, or if they are immigrant, undocumented, underskilled workers. In that sense, I don't like using that word, but so that those are the kind of parallels in which some people have advised other mechanisms for. So can labor unions reach out to a sector of population that is not in the formal workplace in order to and I wonder if Parc Extension works along those lines.
I mean, I think in terms of I mean, can unions? I mean, it's not even can. I mean, they must. I mean, this is the we kind of live in a moment where these kind of marginal forms of labor regimes and sort of coercive labor arrangements are becoming the norm. They're becoming increasingly the norm. It's no longer on the fringes of the labor market, and this is what was so beautiful about the film. It showed explicitly, when people think about these large transnational corporations, they think there's something inherently innovative, right? Because capitalism, it promotes and celebrates and rewards innovation, not the basement of Ali's enterprise in Karachi.
Mm.
But in fact, that's what it does reward, right? And that's what a corporation like Kik or C&A or H&M, or beyond that, even a company like Amazon or Uber, it's not innovation that is being rewarded, but their ability to exploit a large and increasingly precarious and racialized workforce across the globe. and this is what is being rewarded at the end of the day, right? So in terms of whether labor unions should or shouldn't be organizing, it's a necessity, because if we saw what took place in Alabama with the Amazon vote, is a signal to the future for the planet. And it's not just a labor question. It's about who has power in our society and who will no longer have power in our society to make those critical decisions about our planet. And I think it is challenging. It's not an easy question. How do you create unions in spaces where workers are precarious, where the turnover is extremely high, where people have extreme issues that they have to deal with in terms of being forced to accept such labor conditions? That's the kind of, and there's no easy answer. And I think in places like Parc Extension, or in which we also try to, we work with CAPE as well, and with Sonia, and is that we try to be where people are at, and that's fundamentally, I think, first and foremost. And unfortunately, the union model that's been so present is that membership now, union votes now, and not thinking about the long-term struggle, I think has really pushed things backwards. And so I think we're kind of in a moment that's reminiscent of the early days of the labor movement, unfortunately, where you're of the late 19th century, right? In terms of the Knights of Labor, the Temple of Labor, where people were building associations that weren't legally binding, but were actually building a grassroots labor movement that led to the formation of industrial unions. And I think we're at that point again where we have to reorient the labor movement into these areas, into these neighborhoods, into these working class communities, and begin to experiment, because we have an urgent but a long struggle ahead of us. So I think, and always in some places there are, it's not just doom and gloom, there are victories. People were able to unionize fedora, gig workers, mostly racialized, precarious immigrants. The taxi worker organizing, always in New York, reminds me of a historical example, so there are these movements and moments, but and what's taking place in Pakistan, there are worker centers like that all over the world. And I think they're trying to rebuild that labor movement with these workers in these areas.
Yeah. Well, I mean, with that note, I like to maybe conclude our discussion, because I feel like what you just described for us is a kind of the project, where the distinction between the factory floor and non-worker, worker, non-worker, it has to be much more expanded to apply to anyone who needs to earn money to subsist. And, what are the terms are going to be on that? So I would like to also once again thank all the panelists, Ammar, Christopher, Sonia, and Mustafa, for joining us, giving us your reflections, and also this wonderful story that is made almost impossible, this invisible, and of the way in which lives are connected, and also lives that are actually lost in a global supply chains. As Saida says it, that one should always think about the hands that made the shirts, and also the blood that goes into it. And I think that's something that we should remember. So thank you for this fantastic film and this wonderful conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
And thank you all for watching us and
Yes.
the film.
Thank you so much.
Audience, thank you.